Hello and welcome to the second Bristol University Press webinar. This is part of a series of webinars that we're holding during these extraordinary times to look at key issues arising from the pandemic, focusing on areas where learning from events and evidence could create positive social change. I'm Catherine King, Marketing Manager, and I'll be hosting the webinar. I'll be taking questions at the end, so please keep yourself on mute during the talk and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm delighted to introduce Rebecca Willis, author of our book, Too Hot to Handle, The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change, which was published in March. Rebecca is Professor of Practice at Lancaster University and an expert lead for Climate Assembly UK. She was a respondent in the Channel 4 Leaders debate on climate last November. The scientific evidence that we are headed for a climate crisis has never been clearer. Public concern has never been higher. Yet our political system struggles to deal with a problem like climate. What can be done? That's the question that Becky answers in her book, and hopefully in the next 15 minutes. After that, there'll be time for questions. I'm now going to hand over to Becky.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and it's really nice to be able to join you all this morning. I feel like, you know, a few weeks, months in, I still haven't quite managed to get used to online events, and I feel like I need to channel my teenage son's YouTube channel, where he sort of starts every video with a very chirpy "What's up, guys?" and a sort of assumption that there's loads of people out there listening in. So I'm trying to channel a 13-year-old in sitting on my own in a room chatting. I mean, where I wanted to start really, and definitely the inspiration for writing my book, Too Hot to Handle, was this feeling that's best articulated by the veteran earth scientist James Lovelock, who's best known for his Gaia Hypothesis. And a little while ago, he was doing a newspaper interview, and he expressed his really deep frustration with our collective inability to tackle climate change. And he said, it may be an issue as serious as war. It may be necessary to put democracy on hold for a while. And I think what Lovelock articulated in really stark terms was something that I think many in the climate community feel, that democracy gets in the way of climate action and that experts should be in the driving seat. And every day I see new reports and research saying what needs to be done to tackle the climate crisis. And they range from the really obvious and everyday, like the need for a comprehensive shift to renewable energy, to the speculative and as yet unproven, like technologies that promise to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And there's no shortage of experts offering solutions. But I see so much less attention paid to the absolutely crucial question of how we as a human society should debate and agree and carry out plans to tackle climate change. So I think there's a really dangerous illusion sitting behind these prescriptions, and it's something that the social scientist Martin Hager has called the illusion of cockpitism. It's cockpitism is that assumption that you can dictate climate solutions the same way that a pilot might fly a plane. So you can sit in the cockpit, you can chart the most efficient course, and you have perfectly calibrated instruments and levers to do that. And this illusion is really problematic, and not just because the climate system as an entity is far more complex than a plane. It's problematic because it cuts people out. It's a seemingly apolitical view that self-defined experts can decide what's best for people and can impose those solutions. And yet this illusion of cockpitism has a really strong hold over us, I think. And, you know, perhaps surprisingly, even democratically elected governments have been pretty reluctant to actually talk to people and involve people in a dialogue about what needs to happen. So the dominant approach by government has been what I've called climate policy by stealth, focusing on those things like decarbonisation of the power sector, decarbonisation of industry, those things that can be done without people noticing. And government seems to want to try and prioritise things that involve as little change to people's lives as possible, and then hope that people won't notice or won't care. So I think this approach of climate by stealth, this approach based on cockpitism, is deeply problematic. And my own research suggests that it's actually completely the opposite of what's needed. This idea that we need less democracy, less engagement from people is really damaging. And instead, what my research points to really strongly is that we need more and better democracy, not less. Let me give you 3 reasons why we need more democracy, not less. The first is very practical. So, as the Committee on Climate Change has made really clear, we can't get to net zero carbon emissions without people noticing the changes ahead to transport, land use, electricity generation. The list goes on. They need people to engage. And if we are going to get them to engage and to make changes, we need to provide the right structures and systems to enable them to do that. And the bottom line is that people are experts in their own lives, and we need to listen to people about how best to make those changes. So that's a practical case. The second one is linked, but it's more of a moral case. Scientists can tell us the science of climate change, and we absolutely need to listen to them. Economists can offer up their modelling, technologists can offer up their views, but climate change affects all our lives as people in different ways. And actually, when it comes down to it, what gives experts the right to say that they know best, that people shouldn't be involved? Why can we not instead make the assumption that if given the evidence, given the responsibility, given a stake in the process, most people would support action to protect the planet that sustains their life? And certainly in all my experiences of deliberative processes, which I'll come on to, show me that people, people step up to the plate if you give them that choice. The third reason why we need more democracy is actually to do with deficiencies in our current democratic system, and particularly around power relations. So there's very, very good evidence that incumbent companies and industries have undue influence over politics. And this really matters for climate because we need a rapid transition away from the status quo. This means changes to the economy. It means changes to the way that wealth flows. And the companies of the future will, by definition, not have as loud a voice as the companies whose very reason for existence might be threatened. And so you find that companies who resist climate action are getting a bigger voice than they should have because of deficiencies in the democratic system. And one way to overcome that is to involve people much more. So how might we bring about a more democratic approach to climate change? Well, I mean, my first suggestion might sound really obvious, and in a way it is, but there's a real need to speak out, to bring an end to this climate solutions by stealth. I think that politicians and all of us actually need to speak much more openly about the significance of climate change, and they need to ask people to play their part. And I think the upsurge of climate emergency declarations that we saw, particularly last year, might be the starting point for this more honest politics. So as part of this, and perhaps the next step from a climate emergency declaration, is to tell a story of transformation about how acting on climate change is necessary and desirable, and how it links to our other priorities as a society, like jobs and health and fundamentally well-being. And that's never more important than now, in the worst economic crisis that we've seen for many years, and when our lives are in a state of flux like they've never been before. So a good example of this, of a story of transformation, I think, is the Green New Deal in the US. And if you read the original Green New Deal resolution, it's sort of eye-wateringly idealistic. And of course, it has a particular political flavour. It is very much of the left in the US, and not everyone will agree with that. But in a way, that's the whole point. It's offering up a story that inspires debate. And I think it's a very different situation in the UK. So, we've seen a little bit of chatter about this on the left, but while the political right in the UK has pledged their support for the net zero target, which is brilliant, that consensus is brilliant, they've yet to articulate their narrative. And so we haven't actually had an honest political debate between different political positions about what that story of transformation is. And again, linking this to COVID recovery, it's absolutely crucial that we tell a recovery story that has net zero, that has climate action at its heart. And I would like to see competing visions from the major political parties. We've seen tantalising snippets over recent, days and weeks actually, that the government and the opposition parties want to link coronavirus recovery with climate, but we haven't yet seen this confident narrative. Nothing near, I think, the boldness that's needed. So the second thing that I think is really needed is much closer engagement with people. And I've lost count of the number of times that people have used the term, that the experts have used the term consumer. And I always kick back and say, it's not about us as consumers, it's about us as people. So, climate experts are experts on decarbonisation, but they're not experts in people's lives. And we should, I think, have the humility to ask people to work with us to design climate action that works for them. And over the past few months, I've been part of this absolutely incredible experiment that is Cockpit ISM UK. So it's been a gathering of 110 citizens selected as representative of the country as a whole in socio-demographic terms. We met for 3 weekends in a hotel in Birmingham, and then the 4th weekend ended up, because of coronavirus, as several online sessions. And through this process, the participants heard evidence on climate, deliberated on possible solutions, and offered their recommendations to Parliament, and the report's being written at the moment. And, my experience of Climate Assembly UK, without giving away those recommendations, my experience has shown me that if you give people that space to learn and to think and to discuss, citizens can offer up a really confident and often quite radical set of answers, which might be quite different to the ones that experts thought people would go for. So I see processes like this as something that can be used absolutely not to replace representative democracy, but to improve the way that it works. Because after all, a vote is a really blunt instrument. It's a very limited way of telling politicians what sort of a world you want to live in. So I would like to see deliberation like Climate Assembly UK built into our democratic processes as an inbuilt requirement. And that doesn't have to be, the all singing, all dancing 110 people like Climate Assembly UK was. It could be much more fine-grained deliberative exercises as part of policy making, and replacing that sort of pretty stultifying 6-week government consultation process that many of us are familiar with. And again, it's essential that we build this into COVID recovery. That I'm really pleased to see that the deliberation community are rising to the challenge and are looking at ways that we can build deliberation into COVID recovery. That shouldn't be a separate process to climate action. They should be absolutely joined together. So before I finish, I just wanted to link to I've said some sort of relatively systemic stuff about what governments need to do differently, but I think it's really important as well to relate back to we can all do what we can all do as individuals. In fact, what we can all do as people. And I think the prescriptions there are quite similar. And I'd be really interested to hear if that if this chimes with your experience. I think the first thing that's really crucial is to break the silence, to talk about climate change, to get away from this sort of socially organised denial that I think has had a grip of us. So the more we talk about it, at the school gate, with our friends, wherever we might be, the more likely we are to build climate into politics and into our social decisions. I think it's crucial that we all talk to our elected representatives as well. And if you haven't already talked to your MP and local councillors about climate change, please do. And there's a brilliant organisation called Hope for the Future who provide really good resources on how to approach those meetings, how to set them up and how to handle them. And even a lot of people working in the climate domain don't necessarily use their power as an individual citizen. And I would really recommend that. It gives you a great sense of agency as well. I think that the last couple of years have showed us the importance of protest, and some people feel awkward about protesting, but there's an interesting sort of paradox, which is that the least likely you are as a protester, the more likely you are to have your voice heard, because you don't come across like a sort of usual suspect in protest terms. So if you feel awkward about protesting, you're probably exactly the sort of person who should do it. And to my mind, those actions are at least equally, if not more important than the kinds of things we're always told to do in terms of, you know, turning off light switches, eating less meat and stopping flying. Now, those are all really crucial, but I think they're crucial to be able to show your consistency. So, you know, if you don't fly on holiday, then you reduce carbon by not flying. But much more importantly, if your friends know you've done that, if your MP knows you've done that, then the effect is there's a sort of real multiplier effect attached to those actions. So, you know, I think overall we're the situation we're in right now makes this all the more critical, I think, because the opportunity for a climate-focused recovery from coronavirus is there for the taking. But it's not guaranteed. Just because it's necessary, and we all know that it's absolutely necessary, just because it's necessary, just because we have the evidence that it needs to be done, doesn't mean it will happen. And I find that a really difficult fact to live with. And you know, just because the evidence has stuck up on climate, it does not mean that we will necessarily rise to the challenge. But I find the best way of holding and living with that difficulty is to do all that I can to play my part, both as a sort of climate professional and, I think most importantly, as a person. So I'll stop there, but I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts. If you have taken action in your own life or in your professional life, I would love to hear about it, and you know, your own experience, those conversations that you've had. So I'll leave it there and find out what questions we've got from Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was really useful and inspiring talk. We have had some questions, as you rightly say, so and we have had quite a lot, so I'll make a start straight away on them, if I may. The first one was sent in advance of the talk from Gareth Henry. He has two questions. So the first one was, as in February, some 67% of local authorities had declared a climate emergency, though fewer had chosen to align with the 2030 target. That aside, are you hopeful there'll be genuine engagement with the climate change policies at local level, and will further devolution help or hinder this?
Yeah, I think what's happening at a local level is really, really critical. I know, because I'm talking to quite a few, that there are local authorities who are, you know, really, really sincere about their climate change, about their climate emergency declaration, and don't know where to turn next. So in response to the last point, I absolutely think this is about devolution, but it's a devolution of responsibility as well as of you know, funding and powers and so on. So I'm strongly in favour of local areas having their own carbon budget devolved from the national carbon budget. I think all government departments should have a carbon budget, and I think they should have the resources, and including the staffing resources, because that's a big problem at local level, to meet that. So I think more devolution has to be the answer, but it has to be, everyone has to be working towards the target that we derive from the science.
Great, thank you. Gareth, second question. As government, central and local, moves from COVID-19 rescue to recovery, there are growing calls to embed the green economy within any future business stimulus or job creation programmes. Are you optimistic a green-led recovery will come to fruition, or will the current economic orthodoxy win the day as it did in 2008 to 9? Secondly, how might local democracy take the lead in ensuring any recovery is driven by the green agenda?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I remember the Green New Deal as a phrase was actually invented by the New Economics Foundation, which I'm very proud to be a trustee of, a group led by the New Economics Foundation back in 2008. And it didn't get the pickup then. It absolutely should have done. But this time around, it feels like there's a lot more, there's much more of a head of steam behind it. And it's really encouraging to see that language both being spoken about by the opposition parties and also sort of tantalisingly by government. So, I am optimistic this time around. I think my one hesitation would be that the focus tends to be on getting money for the good stuff, like renewable energy and investment in low carbon solutions, and there's much less focus on taking money away from the bad stuff, by which I mean fossil fuel extraction and high carbon investment in airports, roads, that sort of thing. And I think we need a really strong focus on what we are not prepared to spend money on, just as much as what we need to spend more money on. And so and that's the reason there's not as much focus on that is because it's much trickier politically, but that's absolutely part of the honest conversation that we need to have.
Super, thank you. I've also got a question here from Hilary Owen, who says, while I agree with Rebecca's argument for more participative democracy, and in fact have written on this myself before I knew about her work, how do we get the message through to the big polluters such as the USA, Australia, China, etc., and their citizens?
So I mean, I think that the best thing we can do is get it right here. I think that the UK, I mean, frankly, I think that the UK has rested on the laurels of the Climate Change Act for too long now. The Climate Change Act was an absolutely groundbreaking piece of legislation, but it has its flaws. And the main flaw now is that we are not on track to meet the targets, and we don't have the institutional structures in place. We don't have, individual government departments don't have carbon targets, local authorities don't have carbon targets. It's really unclear where responsibility for, below the Prime Minister, it's really unclear where responsibility lies. So I think the more that we can do to get our own house in order, the better. And that's the best way that we'll influence other countries. I think that the US is seen as is obviously really tricksy in climate terms, but individual states are doing amazing things. If you look at what California is doing, I'm speaking to Washington State at the moment about, I'm advising them on a climate assembly. There's an incredible upsurge in climate activism in the US. So I don't actually buy the idea that, we are leading and we just need to get other people to follow.
No, sure. So moving on to a question here from Megan Alexander. She says, of the citizens selected as part of the climate assembly, do you have any insight into how their views may have changed as a result of engaging with scientists, other disciplines, and each other?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. So I can't answer to do with the Climate Assembly, although we will have that data because they were asked to, they did a lot of surveys and they were asked to give their views at several points in the process. And there's also a research study led by CAST, the Centre for Climate and Social Transformation at Cardiff University, who will be looking at that question in detail. I mean, my experience of other processes is that participants do change their views, and quite often I've heard the view expressed that, you know, if it is as big a deal as I've just heard, why is nothing happening? You know, that's the kind of fundamental point that people raise. Like, they can't quite believe the science because of the social silence. And then once they're convinced that the science is as you know, the potential impacts are as drastic as they are, once they understand what, you know, 2 degrees warming means, they can't understand why not more is done about it. And that's a really common finding.
Absolutely. Question from Alison. She says, we saw a drop of 17% carbon dioxide emissions in April, and we've since bounced back to within 5% of last year's levels. To have lasting change, it's clear that we have to get global action across governments and regimes. How is this possible? How can we support it?
Yeah, so I think I was really nervous about any sort of cheerleading around the drop in carbon emissions associated with the pandemic for 2 reasons. One, that, you know, I just don't see any upsides to a pandemic. I mean, you know, I think it's caused, you know, it's caused untold amounts of misery. And I mean, the only thing I would say is that there is now some decent evidence to show that it has opened people's minds a little bit, that, you know, that people have, you know, to a certain extent appreciated aspects of lockdown, and it might mean that they are more open to debate about what might be possible in the future. But, you know, the other reason, as Alison points out, is just that, you know, they are temporary emissions cuts just from not doing something which can very easily be taken up again. So I think lasting change will only come from, you know, from very targeted green recovery programs. And I would particularly look at the changes that are needed in terms of infrastructure. So transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and the idea that any infrastructure should be consented, or any money provided without taking it through a net zero test is, to my mind, just crazy. So, you know, I've developed this whole sideline in fighting a coal mine that's proposed down the road from me in Cumbria. And how crazy is it that I have to spend my time and pull in no end of expert, you know, industrial commentators and economists. I have to pull them all in to make the case why we shouldn't be digging more carbon out the ground. And that just strikes me as so far away from where we should be. You know, it's been an energizing fight, definitely, you know, but it should be a slam dunk that there are no new coal mines. So, you know, we need much clearer guidelines on a green recovery, and we need to just be very cut and dried about what is and isn't acceptable in climate terms.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for more questions. Mark Calverley says, is there research that could inform your proposed way forward? For example, tools that people could use at a local or individual level to better inform their choices?
Yeah, so there's well, I'll plug my book, because everything I've said today is based on academic research I've done over the last 4 years at Lancaster University, and there's a section in the end of that looking specifically at what people can do, both acting, you know, primarily acting as a citizen, as a voter, as someone with a voice, as well as in their role as a consumer. I think specifically at the local level, there's some guidance being produced at the moment on how to run these deliberative processes at local levels. And I think there's a wealth of expertise in local groups, whether that be, you know, everything from, you know, the Wildlife Trusts, Friends of the Earth, Extinction Rebellion. And I you know, I really respect the work that local groups do, and they're a very useful source of expertise, I think.
And talking of your book, one final question says, are there any positive examples of countries that are taking a more proactive approach to linking to sustainability and economic policy? You mentioned Ethiopia in your book. I wonder if you could speak a little more about their approach.
Yeah, so I mean, my expertise is firmly in the UK, but when when I was writing the book, I did a little sort of world tour, and it was fascinating to see. So Ethiopia's development strategy is explicitly based on leapfrogging high carbon development and going straight for low carbon. And I also think it's very interesting to look at some of the Scandinavian countries who have taken a much more civic approach to energy policy, for example. So much more municipal ownership, much more sort of approaching energy as a citizen rather than as a consumer. Equally, there are some states in the US who have pretty strong sort of cooperative approaches to energy. So I think there are really good examples out there. There are also, what New Zealand has done in terms of building well-being and environmental targets into their economic policy and institutionally sort of tying that very closely into the Treasury. That's been really effective. I think it tends to be more effective where responsibility is shared out across departments, possibly with the Treasury taking the lead because they have the money. And that isn't something that we have seen in the UK, but it's definitely something that we could benefit from.
Great, thank you very much. Before we finish, Julia Steinberger asked if you could link to the Cockpit ISM communication resources that you mentioned in your talk. We'll put that out with the recording when we send it after the event. So that just leaves me to
put them on. So I can put them on Twitter as well.
Thank you very much for joining us at this Bristol University Press webinar today, and also to our speaker Rebecca Willis. Too Hot to Handle is available as a print and ebook at 20% discount from our website, bristoluniversitypress.co.uk, or at 35% discount if you sign up to our mailing list. Our next webinar will be on the 2nd of July with Sam Wren-Lewis, author of The Happiness Problem. Please see our social media or website for further details. Thank you.
Thanks.